I absolutely love GeeCON. It's one of my favorite conferences, and Krakow is one of the most beautiful cities in Europe for me, so it's a pleasure for me to come here every year, so thanks for having me again. So, first, I want to say that this is still a work in progress. I started, since I started working with Java, kind of since forever, I always hated the way that I structured my applications. Is there anyone happy with your package structure? Yeah, one hand there, maybe, okay. Is your colleague? Are your colleagues happy with that? Okay. So one of the things that I was always trying to find is even the applications that I joined, or even the applications that I started and I defined the package structure or the source structure, I was always unhappy. At some point, the application was growing, I was unhappy. And so basically what I wanted to do is, if I'm joining a new application, so I wanted to know very quickly, just looking the application from above, what this application is about. So what does this application do? If I need to change something, if I need to add a new feature, fix a bug, where do I go? And everything that I see in all the applications that I worked in the past, when you look from above, you have controllers, repositories, services, parsers, all this. Can you relate to that? Yeah? So you see from above is pure design and architecture. It's cool, but what does it do? Where do I go? And you don't see any domain concepts anywhere. So that's the problem. That's the problem that I was trying to solve. We started kind of a year and a half. I left after 1 year. I left my previous job in January. But for the last year in this job, we started from scratch an application in Scala. And one of our objectives was to try once again to do it properly. And we came up with different ways to organize our code. We wouldn't like to see all the architecture and design concepts mixed with the domain. So I'll give you a few examples. So package structure, layered structure. How many of you structure your code like that? Or have seen that before? See, that's what I'm talking about. What the hell does it do? What is it all about? I have no clue. Yeah, I have page object, awesome, right? And then you say, well, let's try to bring some sanity into this, and let's put some domain concepts in front of all these layers, because we want the layers, they're important, right? And so I say, well, okay, let's put the book and the user, and then you have these duplications. Every time that you try to combine a domain concept and the layers, you have some odd combination. It's very artificial. Then you have all this repetition, and then you end up with one class in each folder. Have you seen that before? Yeah, at least it was not me. I thought that I was the unluckiest person in the world, but it's not the case. So you are all unlucky, or very bad designers like me. And so another one is the MVC, right? So mainly the more opinionated frameworks give you 3 folders, and magically you need to fit all your code in them. So awesome. So this one, I know that is a web app. What does it do? Right? I have no idea, but it's a web app. That's what is important thing. So, yeah. So that's what I was trying to solve. And so not just me, but our whole team. And we were trying to say, well, how can we do that differently? So I could just come and say, well, okay, that's how we are doing. And then we would have a 10-minute talk. But then I wanted to, before I get there, to tell you the thought process that we use, the things that we took into consideration until get to where we are. So, MVC. Right, started in the 70s. And then became a general concept in 1998 when it was first published in a journal. And then you end up, remember, for those of you old like me, started in the 90s with Model 1, Model 2, JSP, servlets, yeah? So yeah, all the variants of MVC when they moved to the MVC to the web. And then we came up with all the crazy adaptations and view adapter and presenter, and then the C# guys or .NET came with the model view model. I have no idea what that is. I don't get that at all. And then presentation, abstraction, control. So there's all these variants of MVCs. But in all of them, or at least the ones that I've seen, they were all implemented very badly. And quite often, we understand view, right? View, we all agree. So yeah, that's what the view is. And then, domain. What normally the more opinionated frameworks will do is say, well, it's your entities, right? And then you have a lot of entities in your model structure or your domain layer. And so it's just a bunch of POJOs, really, with getters and setters and static data. And then say, wow, cool, where the hell do I put my logic? Well, the C is the only place available now, just put stuff inside the controller. And then you have these massive fat controllers. And that's what it's called anemic domain in domain-driven design, where your behavior is not close to your data, if you're talking about OO, not function, of course. So the problem that I see is that all these MVC frameworks and variants, they are right, but they are all wrong at the same time, because like what it dictates which variant of the MVC framework that you're going to use is the view. Is which type of view do you have? And I'll give you some examples. So a web app, a traditional web app with no Ajax, just form, page, backend, page, backend. So normally the controller would be on your backend, right? So you have a very easy, simple view, sending requests, your controller in the backend. But when you talk about single page Ajax applications, then your controller shifts to the view layer, right? So and then it's very blurred, the distinction between your JavaScript code and your controllers and what is doing what. And then you can talk about console-based applications, where how do you do the controllers? Like the view is clear, it's the console, but how do you structure that? And the desktop applications, where you have like buttons, combo boxes, tables, each one of these objects have their own MVC embedded. So games that are very fast-paced and mobile type. So even external systems, you could even treat them as the view. And somehow the queues and web services as controllers, you could go there. So the message here is that the way that you structure your MVC is totally related to your delivery mechanism. And by delivery mechanism, I'm talking about which type of application you have. Is it a web app? Is it a mobile? Is it a game? All the types that I was talking about. So that will change which flavor of MVC you may use, if you use one at all. But the question is, what goes in the model? What is model? And model is another concept that is quite confusing. I'll just get some water. So what is model? Are we talking about the model in MVC, and then each MVC framework defines whatever they want? Are we talking about domain-driven design or domain model in DDD? Are we talking about view model, data model, entities, all this sort of stuff? Is normally every time that people talk about model, they talk about some sort of persistence, right? I don't like that personally. For me, my model is the domain model, is what is described by domain-driven design, where state and behavior are together, and the focus is more on the behavior, is what my application does. And all the data structures, my entities, they emerge from the features that I have, from what I need my application to do. And DDD has a few building blocks. How many of you are familiar with DDD? Oh, quite a lot of people, so I don't need to do a lot of explanation. So very quickly, entities are the objects that you care about their identity, like your user, your book, or something like that. Value objects are the objects that are also a domain concept, but you don't care about their identity, like an address or the type of book or a genre of the book. Then you have factory is an interesting one, because it's not a domain concept, but it's part of the building blocks, because you normally need to create a complex object graph, and then you may use factories, but it's not normally part of the domain. Then repositories is where you manipulate your data. services, three types. That's quite important, the difference. The application service is the one that will control the flow of your application. It's just like the entry point to your domain. Is what the external world is asking your system to do, so the application service will control that flow. And then you have the domain service that are domain specific. So I will have a user service or something like that. It just deals with a domain concept. And then infrastructure, if I need to send an email out, so I can have an email service, but that's infrastructure, it's not part of my domain. The concept of sending an email is part, but the implementation, how we do that, this is not part of the domain. And aggregates, and when you read the books and you try to, it's awesome, it's easy to understand, and you try to implement, it's hell. Right, it's very difficult. I won't go there because I can rant about that forever. So, let's talk about this. So if I make my model be my domain model, then I can embed, and I can split the infrastructure in both sides as well, like is sort of prescribed in domain-driven design, although they don't talk about the delivery mechanism too much. But so both sides have whatever they do, and their infrastructure, the domain, whatever it does, plus the infrastructure, but I keep them totally decoupled. However, if the application is small and it's simple, I can bundle my domain into the same application and deploy the whole thing together. But the separation needs to be very clear. And if I move, if the application grows or changes, I can just wrap my entire domain model. And with some architecture, I can have it deployable. And then you have all these exposed as a web service. How many of you do know about hexagonal architecture? Right, so that's not far off. These boundaries, this infrastructure, that's where your ports and adapters would go. So you are just protecting your domain, and you can have a choice of embedded it into the application or just deploy it separately. That also doesn't change if you are using event-driven, so you can also do that, so it's not a problem at all. Responsibility, so let's talk about the inside. So this is more like are things that we are trying. So the way that we do is, the application services domain-driven design, we prefer to call use cases. So they are the actions that my application performs. So from the outside, from the view, I say, I want this application to do this, like to create a user, to make a payment, to find all the books for this author, to calculate a discount. Those are actions. And that's what I expose to the external world. That is my entry point to my domain model. So the external world, the controllers, may talk to one or two use cases, normally one, but sometimes two, depending on what you are doing. Use cases talk to the domain services. That can be a user service, more domain specific, just related to one domain concept. Domain services can talk to each other. But then when it comes here to the other side, so the small box like is a normal class, by the way. So the repositories, the interfaces are part of my domain, but the implementation is part of my infrastructure. And the rule that we use, not saying that we should all do that, it's just things that we are trying. The entry point to a domain concept is my domain service. So nothing that is inside that domain service, that domain concept, is exposed to the external world, with the exception of the entities that will fly around your entire system. But so what it means is the repositories are not accessed by any class besides the domain service. So domain service 3 would never go to repository 1. It would ask the domain service 1 to get some data, and that could or not delegate to a repository. So that's the rules that we use. Let's talk a little bit about repositories. So as I said, the interface belongs to the model implementation. I don't use the word repositories. I'm trying as much as I can not to use any names that will resemble any architectural layer, anything like that. So if I have a user domain concept, my repository will be users, so use the plural. Sometimes I have book, but the domain language, the ubiquitous language mentioned by domain-driven design, when I'm speaking to my domain, product owners and the rest of the team, they may use library for that. or a book collection. So that's the name that I'm going to use for my repositories. And then I will have my MongoDB, my Oracle implementation. And the difference between a repository and, do you use DAOs? How many of you use DAOs? Yeah, vast majority. I used that in the past, but DAO is more than a pattern to access data. It's really related to a CRUD, like create these, update that, delete that. So it's very data-centric. The repository is a better abstraction. It's like a collection of objects, but with better query syntax. So, but you see the repository as if it was a collection. One of the things that we struggled a little bit, how many of you are familiar with CQRS, Command and Query Responsibility Segregation? Okay, some of you, half maybe. That's where we struggled a little bit. We had situations where our use cases were quite odd to structure, and our domain was very complicated. And one of the reasons is, you know that all that thing that you have an entity, and then you have a one-to-many, a many-to-many, many-to-one, and then you need to say, wow, sometimes I need this entity plus one branch of that object graph. So the user plus all the books. Sometimes I just need the books. Sometimes I need the books, the authors, and all the comments and recommendations, and all these one-to-many, many-to-one, and then you start saying, oh, when is lazy load or eager fetch? And then everything becomes complicated because all the entities are very tight together. In our design now, we split that into the domain models. It's not physical. I just made that because you can go all the way. We didn't go all the way. It's still in the same structure. But we have this notion. So our entities, they have no relationship. They are pure entities. There's no one-to-many, any of these things. So every method, and the same with use cases, is either a command or a query. It's like, do that, or give me that. So the ones that are commands, so the ones that you are updating, inserting, creating, deleting, you very rarely update more than one concept at the same time. You very rarely will change the book description and all the ratings and the author in one go. You do those things independently. But when you read, you want this combination of information. And that's where it becomes complicated. So, and then you need to go through your entire domain model and all your entities, and you start having very difficult, like, how do I bring all that together? It would be much easier, just go straight to the database, do a query full of joins, have a denormalized object that represents what you want, say, bang, there you go. So that's what we've done. So I don't need to go through my entire domain. When I have a query that is complicated, it's a fast track. So the use case, like find recommendations, for example, that can be quite complicated, is a fast track, straight, doesn't go to the normal. So that makes the code far simpler when you are reading, very specific, and the domain model very clean, the part that you write. Right, so finally, what are we doing then? It all starts in here. We are using Maven, but we've done that with SBT as well in Scala. We tweaked the source folder a little bit. We made the distinction between our core domain and our delivery mechanism very clear. So we configured our application to use different source folders. While the application is small, we decided to keep in the same project. You could evolve as it grows to different projects or sub-modules in Maven. Oh, I don't like that. But while it's small, we prefer to be there because everything compiles faster, runs all the tests faster, they can test everything. But we made clear the distinction. Delivery mechanism, one place, core domain, another place. So looking inside, what I have is, in the core, I have 3 main folders. Infrastructure, model, and use cases. In the web, like if that's my delivery mechanism, this will vary, right? According to the delivery mechanism that you have. In the web, normally you have something like that, my controls, my view, my infrastructure. We never paid much attention to that, to be honest. This was working well for us, but our focus was on the core. But that's sort of how they look like. So let's go down a little bit on the web. My controllers. For when Model 1 came about? 1999, 2000. And Model 2, same, 1 year later. So it's been, what, 14 years that we're talking about MVC in the Java world, and we still get it wrong. I still go to application and see controllers this big, doing loads of stuff. So a controller controls flow. View submits, or someone sends an input to your system in the view. Controller say, cool, it normally goes to the right method in the modern frameworks. Okay, I need to invoke that use case. Then your domain model will do all that awesome stuff that it does. Return you something, say, cool, now I got the response from my model, view, display this. A controller should have like 3-4 lines, maximum. Control the flow, that's what a controller does. Everything else is somewhere else, not in the controller. So the infrastructure you can delegate, that varies as well, the type of applications that you are working on, like my JSON, XML parsers, converters, all this kind of nonsense. It's all infrastructure stuff, right? I want you to isolate them. In the view, you can have your page objects, you can have a more, some concepts of some representation of what your views are about. Some validators maybe, and then you have all your static stuff. So, right, core. That's what we've been doing now. In my core, as soon as we open model, I have domain concepts. Like I have book user. So that helps me just opening 2 folders. So when I open model, that's what my application is about. My application is about books, is about users. And then when I open use cases, is what my application does. I have all the actions that my application, my domain model performs. So it adds books to a wish list, it searched book, updates, so they are verbs. So just looking at these 2 folders at a very high level, I can have the answer that I was always looking for. What it does, and what it's about. And then it's easier for me to navigate to the point that I want, or if I add a new feature, I already know where to go. But of course, this is a very simple one. So normally when you are at the this stage of your system, and if it's a CRUD application, you end up with use cases that are very tight to your domain model. So you have use cases like update user, create user, delete user. So it's kind of all your CRUD operations in your use cases, and normally they are a one-liner, a delegation from the use case to the domain service. There is another one-liner from the domain service to the repository. But that's a very simple application. And even domain-driven design, the guys say, if you have a CRUD operation, don't even bother. Right? This is evolves and gets bigger, then you have more benefits. But for example, when it's like starts getting bigger, then you see some distinctions. For example, the purchase one I may not have any entities in there, any domain concept. I have the behavior of buying something, of purchasing something, but I don't have the domain concepts of entities. But I can represent, so make payment, for example, can go straight to an external system to do it, and I may not have a payment entity, for example. So that's when you start, and when the way that we were organizing it, you use probably stories, and like in your development, user stories, and then normally they are part of an epic, part of a bigger feature. You have loads of user stories to control that feature. So my use cases are not related to the user stories directly, are more actions, but normally the way that we group them are for the themes or the features that we have. It's almost like your modules. So then we have something like we have the product module, and that's what it does. You have the purchase model, that's what it does. So you have expressed in your code or in your structure what your code, what your application does, what it's all about. So let's explode, before I do that, let's get some water. Let's explode my model packages this way. So what we've done, we collapsed all the layers. I don't want to see controllers, services, reports. I don't want to see all that nonsense, because business-wise, they make no sense whatsoever. So we just collapsed all of them into a single package. So the book will have all the layers in there. I'll have my, so for example, author would be an entity that is part of the book aggregates in domain-driven design. An aggregate is a domain concept that has a root So book is the root of this aggregate. Author is a object that is used by the book, so a book has an author. And I have my repository that is normally an interface. I have my domain service, that is my book service. I can have other classes, like a book validation, or book validator probably would be better. Genre, that would be a value object in this case. I don't care about the identity, I just care what it is. So it's part of the book aggregate. And I have the same thing for the other ones as well. So I can have more classes that do more business stuff in that folder, but that domain concept contains everything that it needs. How do we enforce that? That's a question that I got before. We don't. The way that we enforce that is by education, by communication, whiteboarding, code reviews. That's what we do. We don't enforce, like, you need to put all the repositories in this folder. We don't do that. So we just talk to each other and talk about the domain, and we evolve. Right, infrastructure. So infrastructure will have all the external stuff and things that are not core to my domain. So if I have, like in my payment domain model, I have a credit card processor or an email sender, I will have the implementation of these things in my infrastructure layer. I'll have my Amex processor, my Visa processor, my SMTP email sender, and like my book to JSON or converted to XML. That's what I would have. So all the concepts in my model, external implementations outside, like gigaspace users. Maybe sometimes my part of my domain is stored in one persistence mechanism. Parts of my domain is stored in a different one. In my model, I have just the users library for books and whatever implementation I have outside. So the collaboration guideline. I'm very thirsty. So that's what I was talking before. A controller may talk to the use cases. Use cases may go down and talk to the domain service. Domain service talk to each other, move down. Not always a domain service may have a repository. So it doesn't need to be something that you persist. A domain service can be a payment service. It's part of your domain, but you may not need an entity. Hence, you may not need a repository. You just may need other things, or validation, or whatever you may have in the payment, and things that send it out to somewhere else, or grab stuff from other systems. So domain service is not related to how you persist, is related to the behavior and the concepts that you have in your domain. Yeah. So an interesting thing is, that led us to some sort of an insight in terms of the execution flow. So it starts from that very end on the left. So that's the input. That is something that triggers an action in my system. Is someone maybe going to the web app, hitting a button, or an external system making a web service call to my system, a message coming into a queue that I'm subscribed. So stuff like that. So that class, the classes on the left, they are the entry point. They handle the flow, and they start the flow. As you move down, so the domain is entry point, so I said all of that. So as you move down, the classes closer to the left, their responsibility is more about controlling flow and delegation. These classes, they don't do anything specific. They have higher abstractions. Say, you go there and do the validation, now you go there, do the payment, now you go there, send the email. But they don't do these tasks. When you get closer to the right-hand side, these classes become far more specific, and they do less delegation. How many of you are following the ECDD dead discussion on Twitter? And a few, okay, right. So I'll get there. And a code, like as soon as there is a trigger in your application, may branch off. So you have many different branches. So when it comes close to the end of the branch, the more specific the class and the methods are. Closer to the beginning of the flow, the more abstract, high level they are. So examples like closer to the left, closer to the input of my application, I have things like process a trade, make a payment. When I start getting closer to the right, it becomes far more specific. It's parse this XML, it's create this user. That's how you can think about it. So testing structure. How do you test all of that? And are you happy with your test names? Like you have unit. How many have unit? Right? How many of you have functional? Acceptance? Right, so if I ask each one of you what they mean, I'll get a completely different answer. If I ask, what are the boundaries of your functional test? What are the boundaries of your acceptance test? It will be completely different. So what I suggest is, you go with your team, whiteboard, make a big box, all the components, all the modules, all the external dependencies, all your delivery mechanism, and say, which boundaries are we interested to test? So then you start drawing circles on it. I will organize my controllers and view in this bit, pass a circle, and then we need to give it a name. So then you give it a name. So what we've done was, we've done this exercise, and we say, okay, that's what it means to us. That's what acceptance means to us. That's what integration means to us, functional means to us. By the way, if you Google for tests, types of tests, you probably find like more than 50 definitions, and they conflict with each other. So one way of doing this, we isolated, we use embedded Jetty. It makes it much easier if you are not deploying your application in a proper application service, web service, servlet container. So we use embedded Jetty. And using embedded Jetty means that my own application, we can run from the command line and start up my application. So I can start up Jetty and I can configure my application and inject whatever I want. So when I'm running my tests on the, what we call user journey, our focus was, how would the user interact with my application? So what is a journey? Oh, a journey, and that's agreed with product owners and business people. So a journey would be, a user goes to the search box, types something, search for the books, add some books to the wish list or the basket, and then say payment. I want to pay. That's a journey. So at that point, I'm more interested to know, is my delivery mechanism taking the user through this journey? And some of these steps will be delegated to my use case. So I can fire up my application with embedded Jetty and mocked or faked or fake use cases, returning whatever I want or with a bit of logic, and then just test that. So those tests can be done with BDD, language, and all the given when then good stuff, using WebDriver and things like that. So that would run very quickly, you don't need the whole thing. And then we have some acceptance. This I'm still not very happy with the name, but we start from the use cases. The use cases, so what's the actions that my application is performing? And I can use also a BDD framework for that. And we mock the external dependencies. So we mock from the repository, but we can test the entire cluster of functionality together. How many of you are using BDD frameworks? Okay, a few of you. It makes much easier, much more descriptive what the feature is about. So then we have integration tests. That's just the boundaries of our system. So just my repositories. Then we normally fire up an in-memory database and check if my queries, my inserts, deletes, they are all correct. So that's another level of tests. And then we have unit tests. We mock everything. I'm from London, and I like outside the NTDD. I'm a mockist, test-driven development, as people call these days, whatever that means. But so I mock all my classes. But an interesting thing about it is some classes, as I was saying, their core responsibility is collaboration, is control the flow. And for these things, you need to test. You need to test the flow. It's sending messages to each object, receiving messages. So that is perfect for outside-in TDD. It's perfect for using mocks. Boundaries are always mocked in any TDD style. But so I prefer mocking, but I use less mocking as I go inside towards the right side of my application. I use far more mocks when I'm on the left side of my application towards the thing. And then outside, we have like a handful, like 3, 4, that test the entire thing. We fire up the whole app and then make sure that the main use cases are connected and wired together. So that's basically what it is. Outside in versus classic TDD, there is a huge debate of what it is. Which one is better, which one is worse, blah, blah. Some people said TDD is dead. That's what I said. I don't mind. The ones that are closer to the left, I use outside in. I always normally do outside in. The ones that are close to the right, I use classical TDD. It doesn't really matter. But the important thing is the responsibility of each class. And I'm way ahead time, and you are all almost sleeping. So you're going to probably finish earlier. That's what it looks like. As I said, it's a work in progress. So that's what it's looking like now. When I say, what is this application about? I will say, it's my model, and it's expressed by nouns. I use nouns to express my domain concepts. What does this application do? I use verbs, I use actions. So with this very simple structure, any person that joins this application wants to change something, wants to know what it does, what it's about, it's easy. It's just a very simple technique. So you go there and express like that. So I'll finish extremely early, so that was half an hour talk. And so that's our work in progress. Any questions? Because that's, yes. Page objects in my product. So the question is, why do I put page objects in my production code? So I think that page objects represent what the model for the view. That's my interpretation. I think that when I have a page and I want to display information on that page, the page object, if I structure, instead of giving all bits and bobs from my domain, I would create a denormalized object that represents exactly what that view wants. But that's the model for the view. So it should be, in my case, in my view, part of the production code. I disagree. I think it depends on which type of application you are doing. For me, the page object will represent my page, and I will use that as the model. So I would gather, like for example, in that query use cases that I was talking about, that would go straight to the database, do a query, and then come up with a denormalized structure to be displayed in the report, report or in the page. I would create a page object, populate that, and then give to the view. So the view say, yeah, get. The view doesn't need to navigate through an object structure. Oh, I see where you're coming from. You are using the object to drive your tests with Selenium and stuff. I think that we were using the same name for different things. Yeah. So in this case, yes, it would be just for tests. I could have something that represents what my page is about and then test from there. But I also use that as, for example, as a view model, if you like. I think that's where I was coming from. Data transfer object is another interesting one because where does it come from, what it is? Like there are many interpretations of what a data transfer object means. So which layer it belongs and things like that. Yes.
What about security? Because for me it's often mixing of infrastructure and business domain.
Infrastructure is interesting. So by infrastructure you mean authentication, authorization, something like that?
Yes, and the business versus business roles.
So, okay, I'll tackle. It depends of the app as well, depends of your delivery mechanism. If I have a single delivery mechanism, I may decide where it goes. So authentication and authorization, if it's not part of my core domain, I would live in the infrastructure of my delivery mechanism. So the controller could talk to that, to do the authorization there, and just pass the user to my domain model without passing user session or anything like that. If my domain model is deployed separately, and I have multiple delivery mechanisms, then authentication may move into my domain model because that would serve to all of them, if that makes sense. So it depends of how I'm structuring. So it would move either from one side to the other, depending on how the thing is structured. Any other question? Yes.
First, a little off topic, if you don't mind. This whole TDD is dead discussion, this is just nonsense. People get real, don't believe it. Then the real question, I didn't see any entities or aggregates in your diagrams, which supposedly should contain all the core business logic. How do you deal with that?
So I left it out on purpose. I was deciding last night if I would put that or not. I should have, because it's the first time I'm giving this talk, so it went really quickly. Where do I decide? So we have behavior. Where does it go? Does it go to the domain service or does it go to the entities? Normally my entities are very simple, are data structure, but they have behavior, but there is a rule for that, in my view. If the behavior is just related to the data that is inside that entity or in that aggregate, that behavior will go to the entity. If the behavior goes across multiple entities of the same time or multiple entities of different type, they will go to the domain service. Yeah, so for example, if you have a user with address and blah, blah, and I want to know it's valid, I could ask the user to know, like, are you valid, or something like that. Or do you have friends? Have you, something like that, if friends was part of that aggregating domain. But if I want to say, I want all the users that have bought this type of book, then it will be on the domain service. Or apply a discount across all the books, all the technical books. That would be domain service and not in the book. That's how I distinguish. Order with items. So the question is, do I have an order object with ordered items? So, as I said, this is one of the parts of domain-driven design that when you read it makes sense, when you implement, it's complicated. It really depends. I know that it sucks, an answer like that. If it's very simple, and I always get to my items through my order, then I will have them together, they will be aggregated, the specific logic will be there, and the domain service will control stuff like that. Multiple orders and stuff. Sometimes the items become concepts on their own, because the items have products. They have the discount applied. They have the people that recommended that item. So related items. So sometimes when you do that, every single object in your domain is connected. And I should have put like our evolution of domain as well. That probably would make more sense, because I've done through the entities. But the example that I was given was, you have a user that has a profile. This user has a trip. And that's how it starts. Very simple. The whole thing is I'll aggregate with the user as the root. But then you evolve. The trip now has photos. And then, but now I want to segregate with the days. All my trips will have multiple days. Each day will have location. Each location has photos. Each photos has comments. So then your aggregate, you need to keep refactoring that, because some concepts will become roots in other aggregates. Still, what is related to them, the behavior will be in these classes, but I use more, for me, the entry point to a domain concept, I still prefer to be my domain service and not the root of the aggregate, because of the complexities of implementing, and for me it makes more sense. But, yes, a few questions.
What's your approach towards modularization? When would you start splitting the apps to modules? Would you, not to grow the big huge monolithic application?
Yeah. So this is an example where the application is already growing. So it started very small with maybe book products. All of a sudden I added a second type of products like electronics, and then the concept of products got bigger. And then here on the use cases, you see that you have like a purchase, user accounts, products. They're not even in the same level. Like user accounts is a very different level from purchase. So where are you? Sorry, again, I lost you. Yeah, cool. When it's growing like that, normally it represents different departments, different people that care about these different features. And when I start growing like that, my candidate of splitting my core domain would be these themes. And sometimes they are even divided by areas of your company. There is a sales department, there is a, I don't know, logistic department, and use cases will be according. So that's where I would start removing them and sending them to different cores, if you like.
Okay, what do you think about events, and where would you put them in your project structure?
So I still haven't had the need to go all the way in the event sourcing and domain events and stuff like that. I think that if I really want to make it decoupled, like if the application starts growing, I may have that. The only problem that I have with all these things, the more indirections that you put and the more you decouple things, of course it's a good thing to decouple, but with decoupling comes complexity as well. Because when you invoke an action in your system, and you may have like 5, 6, 7 domain events being thrown, you start losing control who is listening to those events and what is happening. So you gain decoupling, you can scale better, but you also bring complexity because now you don't have, you cannot just trace in a single line what is happening with your application. And the people that are going all crazy with hundreds of tiny services and domains and queues, or events and queues and all this kind of stuff, they have other problems then. So I think that if they get too big, too decoupled, the concepts in my application, I probably would decouple them. Mainly if the reads, if I need to provide a lot of reports, every time that I get data, I start crossing loads of data, all denormalized. I probably would like to split my domains, and I probably use domain events there. So a book was created, so created book, event is thrown, my read model is listening to that, and then my read model could take that information and then denormalize that according to what the read model needs to provide. So, yeah.
I got a question about the fast track, the read track you mentioned. Do you reuse the domain objects, I mean like user, like book, or do you just operate on the raw database data? I mean, do you fetch the raw database data and mash them up on the application level? Or do you do that on the, do you fetch the data combine the data on a database level and then transport them to the view, or just reuse the authors, the books, and then mash them up on an application layer? Yeah.
So I normally avoid using the. Geez, I have no idea what it is. Yeah, that's one. Depends of how complex my application is. If I'm seeing the early days and it's very simple, I don't even decouple. There's no fast track. As it grows and my queries become more complicated, that's when I start moving away. And then I totally ignore my domain objects. Because normally the pages or the report or the XML message that's going to go out, whatever is going out, whatever needs to gather this data, and they normally will have bits and bobs of my domain. So I will ignore all my domain objects, all my entities and value objects. I'll go straight to the database. This class in the middle can be whatever. Can be a repository just for that thing, but it's not a domain repository. It's a repository for that page, for that concept, like all the books with discounts of 20% that are IT. Right, so that would be, and that would, there was a library that we were not using Play in our Scala project, but we were using I forgot now, I was trying to remember while I was speaking. There's a tiny library that in Play that just goes to the database and returns. It's kind of a small library on top of JDBC. And that's what we were doing. Just using that library, do this big query, give me a totally denormalized object, return.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Any other questions?
I would like a question about the use cases, because you have those classes where, like, what is actually the content of these classes? Do you have some like an aggregate of commands there, and how are you calling them from? I guess you're calling them from the web layer, right, or like from other layers?
It could be any delivery mechanism, right? Could be a web service, for example. I could have like the thing deployed and web service going to my infrastructure and the infrastructure calling the use case.
Sure, but what are the methods there?
So normally it's one method. I try not to have more than one method in the use case. So the use case is responsible for one action. And that action may trigger, for example, an action can be ridiculously big, like you are in like we were in investment bank and stuff. An action is some trades come from the front office, you have this massive XML and say, yeah, process this trade. Like, but processing this trade means writing the entire system. But my use case, if that's the case, because that's my input of the system, so it would be process trade. However, the use case would start doing, go to the trade validator, validates, gets back. Is it valid? Yeah. Now go there and see if there is a related trade somewhere else. So the use case would be controlling this flow, everything that is needed for processing the trade until it will get to another class and say, send to the regulator. So regulator sender or whatever. And then say, now it's all valid, you can report that to your regulator. So the use case is just controlling all these domain services that will be inside my app. Parts of it, so some tasks are even bigger than that. So the use case won't be that big. So some tasks will be related, that would go to a domain service that we will execute these 3-4 steps and then come back and then, so I would modularize that.
Okay, so how would would that relate anyhow to commands? Or would that be a command actually, or it's like something?
They are normally commands,
okay.
But once again, they can also be queries. So the use cases, it depends on what the action that the external world wants from your system. And that's how.
Okay, thanks.
Yes.
I have a question here. So you mentioned at the beginning that if you're doing CRUD application, you don't care about this because it's I don't know, simpler doing CRUD. But every application, even this example you showed with books, will have some CRUD part. Like I don't know, you need to create books, edit them, change them, I don't know, add description and stuff. So would you have a part of your application that would use, I don't know, REST? Resource would be, would use resources like books and be a CRUD application, and would it use your domain, the whole thing, the whole model, or would it be something separate? How would you connect those two things?
So let's see if I can summarize the question. So we use that for more complex domains, but if I had a CRUD part of my system that is simpler, would I use the same structure? Is it fair to say that as a summary? I would. Reason being is, I think that it's better to have some sort of pattern that you recognize, even if, so for parts of the system is much better. For parts of the systems will be a one-liner delegation from the use case to the domain service. But the pattern is in there and you can see these things. So it's a price you want to pay. Like, do I want these just to keep the structure? I think that if 90% of my application is composed by CRUDs, it's a different story. I probably wouldn't use many of these things. If a percentage, whatever that percentage may be, I won't give you a number because that would be a mistake. But it's a number that I'm comfortable that is small enough that wouldn't impact the whole thing. I would keep the same structure. I prefer to have the patterns in place than have parts of my systems that are in one way and parts of my systems that are in different ways.
Thank you.
Any other question? No? Okay, thank you. Cheers.